When you think about Hitler's story, from his time as a struggling artist to a soldier to the leader of Germany, there is one chapter that is just so much darker than the rest. It's the one that truly defines his legacy. Today, we're going to dive into the machinery of the Holocaust. Right, because it was this systematic campaign of pure hatred and murder that cemented his place in history as one of its most notorious figures. This wasn't just some tragic byproduct of war, no, this was a deliberate, ideological mission of total annihilation.
So, to really get a grip on the Holocaust, you have to go back to its roots. The hatred of Jewish people in Europe wasn't some new thing the Nazis invented. But what they did was take centuries of prejudice and twist it into something far more sinister and way more deadly.
See, for hundreds of years, this prejudice was mostly about religion. Jews were often scapegoated, leading to all sorts of social and economic discrimination. But the Nazis, they completely flipped the script. They argued it had nothing to do with religion at all. It was about race. They pushed this idea that Jews were a separate, inferior race that was a biological threat to their so-called Aryan people. During his early formative years in Vienna, Hitler just soaked up these ideas from some pretty prominent anti-Semitic figures. Guys like George von Schonerer and Vienna's mayor Karl Lueger, who really showed him how you could weaponize anti-Semitism as a political tool. In fact, Hitler was so impressed, he called Lueger the greatest German mayor of all time in his own book, Mein Kampf, where he laid out his entire hateful ideology for the whole world to see. Now check out the date on this slide, 1922. That's more than 10 years before he even comes to power. It gives you a chilling insight into his worldview, which was already fully baked. In his mind, it was a zero-sum game, a fight to the death between two races, and only one could come out on top.
And let's be clear, this twisted ideology wasn't just talk. It was methodically and ruthlessly turned into state policy. They built an entire legal framework just for persecution.
The second Hitler got power in 1933, the attacks started. Boycotts of Jewish businesses, social exclusion, you name it. But the system really locked into place 2 years later, with the passing of the Nuremberg Laws.
So here's the crucial point. This wasn't just social pressure anymore. This was now the law of the land. These laws were specifically designed to completely isolate Jewish people, stripping them of their citizenship and basically making them legal outcasts in their own home country. They legally defined who was German and who wasn't, based on nothing more than who your grandparents were.
Okay, so you had this legal framework in place. Now, the persecution was about to take a terrifying new turn, escalating from legal oppression to organized nationwide violence. The trigger, or maybe a better word is the excuse, came in November of 1938. A German diplomat in Paris was assassinated by a young Jewish man who was distraught over his parents' deportation. The Nazis saw their opening and seized it, using his death as the pretext to unleash a pre-planned storm of violence. And this is where you see that huge shift. It became known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. It was a brutal, coordinated attack. All across Germany and Austria, synagogues were burned, Jewish-owned stores were smashed to pieces, and the streets were literally covered in shattered glass. This was the moment the mask well and truly came off. State policy was now state-sanctioned terror, out in the open for everyone to see. As the Second World War kicked off, the Nazis saw the perfect opportunity to escalate their plans from persecution and violence to something truly unimaginable: the systematic extermination of an entire people. So as Hitler starts grabbing more territory, annexing Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia, you can see where this is going. His invasion of Poland in 1939, that was the final straw. It triggered a world war, a conflict that would become tragically tangled up with the fate of every Jewish person in Europe. I mean, think about it. The entire world is distracted by battles and borders, and the Nazis now have control over these huge new territories in Eastern Europe. They saw their chance. The sheer chaos and brutality of the war created the perfect conditions for them to carry out what they called their final solution. And from 1941 to 45, this was the Holocaust's final, deadliest phase. This wasn't about forcing people to leave anymore, or even about imprisonment. This was a deliberate, state-sponsored program of mass extermination. The goal was simple, and it was horrifying: murder every single Jewish person the Nazis could find. So how did they even attempt something so monstrous? Well, It really boiled down to two primary horrific methods. First, mass shootings, carried out in broad daylight in over 1,500 different towns and villages. And second, a cold, calculated industrial method, gassing operations in specially built killing centers. Just let that number sink in for a second. Over 2 million men, women, and children were murdered by these mobile killing squads. They were often forced to dig their own graves before being shot and pushed in. And then you have the factories of death. At just one of the major killing centers, Auschwitz-Birkenau, over 1 million people were systematically murdered, most of them in gas chambers with a poison gas called Cyclone B. Over 1 million people in just one place. And it's no accident that all of these industrial killing centers were strategically located in German-occupied Poland. Places like Chelmno, Belzec, Treblinka, and of course, Auschwitz-Birkenau. They weren't just camps. They were designed for one purpose and one purpose only: mass murder on an unprecedented industrial scale. By the time the war was finally over, this methodical campaign of hatred had resulted in the murder of an estimated 6 million Jewish people. It remains one of the largest and most systematically executed genocides in all of human history. But as Allied forces closed in from both the East and the West, the regime responsible for this unimaginable horror began to crumble. And the architect of it all, he was about to face his own end. Picture this. The Soviet Red Army is literally taking the streets of Berlin right above his head. Hitler retreats to a bunker deep underground. In his final hours, he marries his longtime partner, Eva Braun. And the very next day, with his 1,000-year Reich completely in ruins, they both committed suicide. The final tally of his ambition and his hatred is just staggering. A world war that killed over 60 million people, a continent left in absolute ruins, and a genocide so horrific it permanently scarred the conscience of the entire world. And all of that leaves us with a really critical question, doesn't it? Understanding how this happened, that step-by-step process from hateful words to hateful laws to mass murder, is absolutely essential. Because really, the only way to truly honor the victims is to make damn sure we can recognize the warning signs and stop this kind of dissent from ever happening again.